The Whispering Shadows. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. My friends and I rented a cabin in the woods, far from the city. The air was crisp, and the surrounding forest seemed untouched by time. Little did we know, the cabin had a dark past, one that would soon catch up with us. As night fell, strange sounds began to echo from the trees, faint whispers that sent chills down my spine. "It's probably just the wind," Sarah said, trying to calm the rest of us, but I wasn't convinced. The wind didn't sound like that. It was more like murmurs, as if someone was speaking just out of reach. We sat in silence, listening. Every crackle of the fire made the whispers grow louder. "We should check the woods," I suggested, though I wasn't sure why. Something urged me to leave the safety of the cabin. The woods were darker than I'd imagined, with the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. As we ventured further in, the whispers intensified, surrounding us from all directions. I looked back, but the cabin was barely visible through the trees. "Maybe we should head back," Sarah suggested. I agreed, but something inside me wanted to push deeper, as if the forest was calling to us. We turned to head back, but the path seemed different now. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by strange, twisted shapes in the underbrush. I looked to my friends, but they seemed just as confused. The whispers were now full of urgency, almost like they were begging us to stay. "Do you hear that?" Mike asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, but couldn't bring myself to speak. The atmosphere grew heavier as we walked, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Suddenly, Sarah screamed, pointing toward the trees. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the line of sight, its form shifting like smoke. We froze, hearts pounding. It stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. We all stumbled backward, panic flooding through us. But the figure didn't move. It just watched. We tried to run, but it felt like the ground was pulling us back. My legs refused to move, frozen by some invisible force. The shadowed figure began to speak, its voice soft but clear. "You should not have come here," it whispered. My skin crawled as the words seemed to invade my mind. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, everything went black. I awoke on the cold, damp forest floor. My friends were gone, nowhere in sight. The whispers had stopped, but the air was still thick with an ominous presence. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest. The forest felt alive, as though the trees were watching me. I called out for Sarah and Mike, but my voice echoed back at me in a distorted, mocking tone. The forest felt wrong. It was as if it had changed overnight. The trees were taller, the shadows deeper, and the silence oppressive. I wandered for hours, disoriented and scared. At one point I thought I saw a flicker of movement ahead, maybe Sarah or Mike. I rushed toward it, but when I arrived there was nothing, just the empty, endless woods. The sun was setting, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. As night began to fall, I heard it again, the whispers. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, circling around me. "Come closer," they beckoned. "It's not too late." I followed the voices without thinking, my feet moving on their own. The deeper I went into the woods, the more the whispers became clearer, more distinct. I wasn't sure what I was looking for anymore. I felt like I was being drawn toward something. But what? The darkness closed in around me, the trees looming like silent witnesses to my every step. Then, I saw it, just ahead. A figure stood in the clearing, draped in a tattered cloak. It was tall, its face hidden in shadow, but its presence was overpowering. My heart pounded in my chest. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice echoing in my mind. It didn't speak with its mouth, but I could hear it as if it were right next to me. "Leave now, while you still can." But the words didn't make me want to leave. They only made me want to get closer. I stepped forward, hypnotized by the figure's presence. The whispers had stopped now, replaced by an unsettling silence. The figure raised one arm slowly, and in its hand, a flickering light appeared, glowing a sickly green. It gestured toward the ground, where I saw an old stone altar covered in moss and dirt. I felt a compulsion to kneel before it, as if something deep within me knew what needed to be done. The figure didn't speak again, but its presence urged me forward to offer whatever it was asking. As I knelt before the altar, I felt a sharp, icy wind swirl around me, as if the forest itself were alive, breathing in time with my every movement. The whispers returned, this time louder, more frantic. I felt a pull in my chest, a force dragging me toward the altar. I reached out to touch the stone, and the moment my fingers made contact, the world seemed to shudder violently. A flash of light filled the clearing, blinding me. I closed my eyes, but the light pierced through, burning into my mind. I could hear screams, my own, mixed with others. When I opened my eyes again, the clearing was gone. I was no longer in the woods. I was standing in a vast dark void surrounded by swirling shadows. The air was thick with the scent of decay. "Welcome," a voice said, its tone cold and distant. It was the figure. "You have crossed into my domain." The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as though it was shifting and moving. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The shadows pressed in on me from all sides, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was trapped. Suddenly a figure appeared before me, a woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and empty. She reached out with trembling hands as though trying to touch me. They didn't believe me. She whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "No one believes the stories. But you've come, just like the others." Her fingers brushed my skin, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible in the suffocating silence. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, as though afraid of something. "I was once like you," she said, her voice breaking. "We all were. Trapped here, unable to leave. It's only a matter of time before they come for you, too." Her eyes filled with a deep, unspoken terror. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice shaky. The woman didn't respond at first. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. Then she whispered, "The shadows. The ones who rule this place." Before I could ask more, the air around us began to shift. The shadows seemed to pulse and move, as if alive. Something was coming, something powerful. I could feel it, like a storm brewing in the distance. The woman grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the edge of the void. "You have to leave," she pleaded, "before it's too late. They're coming." But it was too late. The shadows began to swirl violently, a deafening roar filling the air. I tried to break free, but the woman's grip tightened, her fingers cold as ice. "Don't let them take you," she begged. But it was already too late. A monstrous shape emerged from the swirling shadows. It was massive, its body a writhing mass of darkness, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The woman screamed, her voice lost in the chaos. I tried to run, but the shadows reached out, wrapping around me, pulling me back toward the creature. I struggled, but my strength was failing. The creature loomed closer, its presence suffocating. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural sound that vibrated in my chest. "You are mine now." The shadows closed in, and I felt a deep, cold despair wash over me. My limbs went numb, as if the very air was draining my life away. I could feel the creature's breath on my skin, its grip tightening with every passing second. I was losing control, slipping into darkness. Then a flash of light cut through the shadows. A voice, someone familiar, called my name. "Wake up!" it shouted. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if the figure in the void was real, but the voice sounded like Sarah. I tried to reach out, but I couldn't move. The light flickered again and the shadows recoiled, retreating for a moment. The whispering shadows. Continuous so. "Wake up." Sarah's voice was louder now, more urgent. It was the only thing that seemed to cut through the suffocating darkness. I tried to focus on it, trying to will myself back to reality. The shadows around me were still, watching. Slowly I felt my limbs begin to move again, but it wasn't easy. My body felt as though it had been weighed down by an invisible force, every motion sluggish and strained. Finally, my eyes snapped open, but everything was disorienting. I was no longer in the void. I was back in the forest, my back against the cold, damp earth. My breathing was shallow, and I was soaked in sweat. The night was quiet now, too quiet. I sat up quickly, looking around. The familiar dark woods stretched out in every direction, but something felt different. The air was heavier, as though something was waiting, watching. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented and terrified. Had it all been a dream? The shadows? The figure? Sarah? Where was she? Where were my friends? I called out their names, but my voice seemed to vanish into the oppressive silence. I felt the weight of my own isolation. There was no response, just the rustling of the wind in the trees. It wasn't right. None of it felt right. I wandered through the woods, unsure of where to go, my mind reeling from what I had experienced. Was the figure real? Was the woman real? My legs ached, and the cold had seeped into my bones, but I pressed on. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, the snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves. And then, just as I thought I might be losing my mind, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, yet unmistakable. You shouldn't have returned. The voice echoed from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there. Only the shadows creeping along the edges of my vision like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. The voice came again, this time closer, its tone chilling. It's too late to leave. I felt a cold hand brush the back of my neck and I whirled around in terror. Nothing. No one. Just the suffocating silence of the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest seemed to close in on me, the trees leaning in as if they were watching, waiting. I stumbled backward, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. And then in the distance a flicker of light caught my eye. It was dim, flickering like a candle in the wind, but it was there. I had to go toward it. As I moved toward the light, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. It was as if the forest itself was alive, desperate to stop me from reaching whatever lay ahead. My heart raced and I broke into a run, determined to reach the light before whatever was chasing me could catch up. The air felt thick, the shadows pressing in on all sides. Every step I took felt heavier than the last. The light grew brighter as I neared, but it was not a comforting light. It was an unnatural glow, sickly green, flickering like a dying flame. The air around it was cold, as if the warmth was being drained away. I slowed to a halt as I approached, dread pooling in my stomach. There, in the center of the light, stood the woman from before, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "It's not safe. You've already made the mistake." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice failing me. The woman raised a hand to her mouth, a gesture of silence. "The shadows," she continued, her voice shaking with fear. "They will come for you. They always do." Her eyes darted nervously around the clearing, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. I didn't understand. The shadows were already here, weren't they? They had already found me. The air was thick with their presence, their whispers lingering like a poison in my mind. "They don't leave," she said, her voice barely audible. "Once they have you, there is no escape." The ground beneath us began to tremble, the trees swaying violently, as though something enormous was moving beneath the earth. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond immediately. She just stared at the ground, as if the answer was too terrible to speak aloud. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes wide with a fear that I had never seen before. "The Ancient Ones," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The ones who came before us. They dwell in the shadows, in the space between worlds. And they're hungry." A deep guttural growl echoed from the darkness, the sound reverberating through the trees. The ground shook again, more violently this time, and I felt the presence of something enormous moving toward us. The woman gasped, her eyes filled with terror. "You need to leave, now." But it was too late. The shadows swirled around us, thick and dark, blocking out the faint light that had surrounded her. I tried to move, but the air was suffocating, thick with dread. "You are mine," a voice whispered, its tone ancient and deep, like the sound of rocks grinding against each other. The shadows pressed in tighter, wrapping around us, cutting off all escape. The woman screamed, her voice echoing through the forest, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The growl grew louder, and I could feel the ground beneath my feet begin to give way, as if the forest itself was being torn apart. I reached out, desperate to grab hold of anything that might save me. My hand brushed against something cold, something solid. It was the altar from before, the stone altar I had seen in the void. How was it here? How was any of this real? The woman was gone now, swallowed by the shadows. I was alone, surrounded by darkness, the growls growing louder with each passing second. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper. I felt the shadows crawl over my skin, seeping into my very soul. "You belong to us," the voice whispered again, the growl now almost deafening. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The darkness closed in, and I felt myself being pulled toward the altar, as though it were drawing me in, pulling me closer with every heartbeat. Suddenly a sharp pain pierced my chest, and I gasped, stumbling back. I looked down, but there was nothing there. The pain intensified, a burning sensation spreading through my body. The shadows had pierced me, their cold tendrils sinking deep into my flesh. I fell to my knees, my breath ragged as the pain consumed me. The darkness was closing in, and I had no strength left to fight it. The figure appeared again, standing over me. It was the one from the forest, the one who had whispered to me. It was not a man or woman, but something far older, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. It leaned down, its voice deep and resonating. "You belong to us now." The words echoed in my mind, filling me with an overwhelming sense of despair. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the shadows. The pain in my chest intensified, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. The world around me began to fade, the light dimming as if the very essence of existence was being erased. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its face becoming clearer in the fading light. "You are ours," it whispered, its voice reverberating through my mind. "There is no escape." I closed my eyes, feeling the darkness consume me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was nothing. No whispers, no shadows, no pain, just an overwhelming silence. But even in the silence, I felt the presence of the shadows, watching me from the depths of the void. They were waiting, patient, hungry, and then the silence shattered. I struggled to my feet, panic rising in my chest. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing, just the ever-encroaching darkness. The shadows were closing in, pressing against me from all sides. I could feel their eyes on me, the weight of their hunger bearing down on my very soul. The whispering shadows, continuous so. The ground beneath me trembled once more, and I gasped, my eyes snapping open. I was no longer alone. The shadows had returned, swirling and writhing, their presence undeniable. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, as though the darkness itself had taken root inside me. The air was thick with a cold, suffocating energy that seemed to press against my chest, making it hard to breathe. "It's not over," a voice echoed from the depths of the shadows. It was a familiar voice, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't Sarah's or any of my friends. This voice was deeper, older, like the sound of ancient winds howling through forgotten tombs. "You thought you could escape, but you've only begun to understand what you've awakened. You should have never come here." The voice whispered again, its tone mocking, as if I had failed some ancient test. "Now, you are ours to play with." I stumbled backward, heart racing, my breath shallow. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as if the very earth was alive, reacting to the darkness that had taken hold. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, its body a mere silhouette, its features obscured by the thick, swirling mist. The only thing that stood out was its eyes, two glowing orbs, pulsating with an otherworldly light. It was impossible to tell if it was human or something else entirely, but the presence it exuded was unmistakably terrifying. It reached out toward me, its hand long and clawed, and I felt an icy chill sweep through my body. No, please, I whispered, backing away, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. There was no escaping it now. The shadows were everywhere. They were a part of me, a part of the world, and there was no way to break free. The figure loomed closer, its eyes fixed on mine, its gaze piercing through my very soul. "You cannot run from what you are," it said softly, its voice a low growl. "You are a part of the darkness now." The claws of the shadow reached toward me, and for a moment, I felt a strange calm. I had no strength left to fight. The pain, the terror, the suffocating presence of the darkness, it all seemed to converge into a single point, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the forest. The air was thick and oppressive, the walls around me unfamiliar. I was in a room, a small dimly lit chamber, the walls covered in strange markings that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to move, but my body felt sluggish, heavy, as if I were trapped in a nightmare. The shadows were still with me. They pressed against the walls of the room, creeping closer with each passing second. I could hear their whispers again, this time louder, more distinct. "You are not free," they murmured, their voices a chorus of darkness. "You will never be free." The room around me seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening as if they were feeding on my fear. I forced myself to stand, the effort a struggle, my muscles aching with the weight of the darkness that had consumed me. I looked around the room, desperately searching for an escape. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the markings on them shifting in unnatural patterns. I felt a cold chill seep into my bones as I realized that the room was alive, alive with the shadows, with the ancient evil that had claimed me. The door at the far end of the room creaked open, slowly, as if it were being pulled by an unseen force. A figure stood in the doorway, its form shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. The whispers grew louder, filling my head, drowning out everything else. The figure stepped forward, its steps silent, yet the floor seemed to tremble beneath its weight. "You belong to us now," the figure said, its voice a guttural growl. "There is no escape." I tried to speak, to scream, but my voice was stolen by the shadows, swallowed before it could even leave my throat. The figure advanced, and I could feel its cold breath on my skin, like the chill of the grave. It reached out, its hand stretching toward me, and I could see the dark, jagged claws that ended its fingers. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows were closing in, their whispers now deafening, filling every corner of the room, pressing against me from all sides. The walls seemed to shift, the markings on them now twisting into grotesque shapes, as if they were alive. I could hear the distant sound of something moving in the darkness, something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and I could feel my mind slipping away, consumed by the darkness. I tried to resist, to hold on to my sanity, but it was slipping through my fingers like sand. The shadows were inside me now, crawling through my veins, sinking into my very soul. The figure's voice was the last thing I heard before everything went silent. "You are ours," it whispered, its voice fading into nothingness. "You always have been." The world went dark once more, and I was lost, drifting in the void. The whispers faded, but they were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to rise again. I didn't know how long I had been here, trapped in the shadows. Time no longer existed, and the very concept of light seemed foreign. And then in the distance I saw it. A flicker of light. It was weak at first, but it grew stronger with each passing moment, pushing back the darkness, creating a small pool of warmth in the otherwise cold, empty void. I reached toward it, desperate for escape, for freedom. But the shadows followed, creeping behind me, crawling across the ground like living things. They reached for me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, and I could hear their voices growing louder once more, filling my mind with the same words. "You belong to us." Their whispers were relentless, suffocating. I reached the light, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might be free. But as I stepped into the light, I realized something terrible. The light wasn't a way out. It was a trap. A beacon. The shadows had led me here, to this place, to this moment. The light wasn't salvation. It was their domain, and I was about to become one with the darkness forever.